Hi, and welcome to my talk on demystifying code for admins, the last step to Apex. My name is Adam Olshansky, and I'm a Salesforce engineer at Google. So a little about me briefly. I'm a 7-time Trailhead Ranger. I have 15 Salesforce certifications, and I'm really passionate about helping people decode on the Salesforce platform. I'm also a Salesforce MVP, and would love to connect with you afterward on Twitter at Adam17AMO. You can also shoot me an email and check out my blog at adam2architect.com. And if you're not yet on the Lightning experience, I have a Pluralsight course that might be able to help you out. You can find that at bit.ly/lightning migration. And with that, let's get started with the talk today. So some things I want to just kind of level set at the beginning to set expectations here. I'm going to be talking about concepts in declarative development, things you probably already know how to do. But again, I want you to focus on the concepts behind these tools that you already know how to use. I'm going to show you some small blocks of code. And I really want you to not get too hung up on the syntax, all the little punctuation marks and things like that, but really focus on what the small blocks of code are doing. I don't want anyone walking out of here thinking they're going to be able to learn how to code in 40 minutes. Just unfortunately not possible. But I do want you thinking that you can begin the process of understanding code in the next 40 minutes or so. Now, with that, I'm a big believer that if you can understand code and you can do a Google search, you can begin the process of writing code. But even just understanding code is going to increase your value to both your company and yourself, right? If you're working at your company and there's an issue, maybe with something that's running in Salesforce, and you can take just one step further to troubleshooting it on your own before you have to reach out to the developer, that's going to bring tremendous value. Maybe you can start the troubleshooting process and point your developers in the right spot. Maybe you can start solving some small problems yourself. Or maybe you can just get a better sense of what the code in your org is doing and how changes are going to affect it. From an individual standpoint, right? If a recruiter is looking at, or a hiring manager is looking at 2 resumes of a Salesforce admin, one understands code and one doesn't, which do you think is going to get a little bit of a bump? So, and not only is it going to be able to increase value to your current company, but it'll potentially set you up for success in future roles as well, and maybe even get you interested in the process of becoming a full-time developer on your own at some point, right? But just understanding code in and of itself is already, I think, going to be a helpful process to you in your career. All right, so for the agenda for this talk, I'm going to start off with talking about kind of just a high level, what is code, what is Apex, and then we're going to go over a review of admin tools and concepts. Again, these are probably tools you work with on a daily basis, things you already know how to use, but I want to emphasize the concepts behind all of these tools. From there, we're going to get into Apex building blocks, and then we're going to take the building blocks we learned in Apex and put it into some Apex examples. And from there, we're going to wrap things up and talk about next steps and where to go from here. All right, so my hypothesis for this talk is you're already all developers, you just may not know it yet. And we'll see if by the end of the talk you agree with me. All right, so let's start off talking about what is code. I promise it's not as scary as you think. So at the end of the day, this is all code is. It's ones and zeros, it's computer language, right? Now, I don't know about you, I don't tend to understand ones and zeros very well since I'm not a computer. And most humans don't understand ones and zeros either. And so fortunately, software developers over the years have developed what's called a compiler or a translator to translate what we are writing in code and maybe Salesforce configuration into ones and zeros that Salesforce can understand or any computer can understand. And you might be familiar with this concept already if you've ever built a formula and run the check syntax button. That's Salesforce trying to convert your formula field into ones and zeros that Salesforce can then understand. And that's why it'll tell you if it doesn't understand, it'll give you an error message. And over time, developers have tried to make it easier and get one step closer to the ones and zeros. We started off when people were first starting to code with these punch cards, and you had to physically punch holes in the cards that represented the ones, and you feed it into the computer, and it would read the holes that were punched as ones and the non-holes as zeros. And from there, we got a little more sophisticated. We started telling the computer, hey, I want to store this value in memory. I want to store this other value in memory, and I want to combine them. And again, that became a little cumbersome. So programmers started developing these more kind of sophisticated languages like C that's based on logic and Java. It's a little more readable for human beings. And Salesforce has just taken it one step further and said, hey, you don't even need to write code anymore. You can just do all this in point and click development with Salesforce configuration. But if you've ever played the game of telephone or tried to communicate with somebody in a different language, right, as you get farther and farther away from the source, more things tend to get lost in translation a little bit. And so the farther away we get from ones and zeros, the more that has the potential to be lost in translation, and it's going to be a little bit harder to communicate. So today we're going to take one step toward the ones and zeros from our Salesforce configuration over to the Apex side of things. And we're going to allow ourselves to remove some of the limitations of Salesforce configuration and get one step closer to communicating with the computer in its own language. All right, so now that we talked about what code is at a high level, let's go over a review of admin tools. And when I say admin tools, I'm talking about these things that already make awesome admins heroes, right? These are going to be our objects, our fields, our reports, our formulas, workflow rules, process builder, and of course, flow, right? Tools you probably are already familiar with already. And again, when we talk through these, I want you to focus on the concepts actually behind these tools that you already know how to use. And so what I mean by concepts is, let's start off with objects and fields, right? And objects and fields use the concept of constructing a data model. And this notion that we're going to tell Salesforce, hey, I want to store some data. And because I want to store data, I have to tell you what type of data I'm storing. So maybe I'm creating a checkbox field, maybe I'm creating a number field, a text field, whatever field I'm creating, I have to tell Salesforce what kind of field it is ahead of time, right? And then from there, with both fields and objects, we'll give it a label that's going to show up in the Salesforce UI. And then we're going to tab over and it's going to generate this API name. And the API name is actually what's important to us as developers, right? And for the most part, an API name just replaces spaces with underscores because spaces and code don't really play well together. And then it'll add __C to the end of it just to tell Salesforce that it's custom. So if you're working with the standard account object, its API name is just going to be account. If I make a job application object, for example, I might have the API name be job _application __C. If I make an applicant field, I might have the UI just be applicant field, the UI name, and the API name will be applicant _name __C. All right, another concept we're probably familiar with is reports, right? And if you think about a report, it's this notion that we're going to choose some object and we're going to pick some fields we want from that object or set of objects. And we're going to put some filter criteria, some condition on it to retrieve a set of objects. For example, here I can say I want to report on account. I want to get the account name, type, and rating fields. And I want to get all the accounts where the customer, the type equals customer direct or customer channel. All right, but this notion of creating reports, get some object, give me some fields, and give me some condition, probably something we're familiar with already. All right, formulas. You've probably made formula fields before, probably more than one. And if you think about the concept of a formula field, we're taking some value that we usually know as an input. We're doing some black box calculation on it, and we're ending up with some outputted value. And again, just like when we create any other field, we have to tell Salesforce what type of output it's going to be. So maybe I'm starting with some string value and I'm turning it into a checkbox. And maybe I'm doing some functions to it inside my formula to change it a little bit. So some examples could look like this, right? I might have a formula field called deadline, and it's taking some value I know today, adding 5 to it, and outputting the date 5 days from now. Right, this notion of calculating values based on other values. Or if we go back to our job application example from before, maybe I have a field called approval required, and it's going to be a checkbox. And I want to take two things I know, the user experience on the job application and the parent jobs department. And I'm going to change the syntax on this a little bit to make it a little more code friendly. Instead of the and formula or the and function, I have a double ampersand. Reads the same way. I find this a little bit easier to read, and this is how we'll read it in code. But it says the same thing, and it's just saying if the years of experience in the job application is greater than 5, and the parent job department is equal to IT, then approval required is true, otherwise approval required is false. So we took two fields we knew, and we did some check on it, and we ended up with a checkbox, true or false, at the end. And formulas can get really complex, right? We can kind of chain different functions together within a formula. So we might have something like this, right? We might record the date time submitted of an application, and we want to calculate what hour was that application submitted in to kind of keep track of when is it that people are actually submitting their applications? And let's say we actually want that hour in the form of text. So we start with a date time. Let's say it's happening today, December 3rd, 10:15 a.m. So we'll get our date time submitted value, and we'll take that date time submitted and we'll put it in the time value function first. And the time value is going to take our date time and turn it into 10:15 a.m. Okay, great. So now we have our 10:15 a.m. It's going to go up to the hour function. The hour function is going to take 10:15 a.m., turn it into the number 10. And then we're going to pass that up to the text function. So we're going to take the number 10, put it into the text function, and we're going to get the text 10. And so if you think about it, the formula took our date time submitted, December 3rd, 2021, 10:15 a.m., did our black box calculation, and we ended up with the text 10 at the end, right, by chaining these functions together. Right, and then another type of formula we could have is this notion of having multiple conditions with a fallback. So I might want to calculate the priority on an opportunity, and it's going to be based on the amount. So I could say something like, if the amount is greater than 1 million, set the priority to high. If that's not true, check the amount again to see if it's greater than 100,000. If it's greater than 100,000, we're going to set it to medium. And then we can have a fallback at the end as well, right? So if all of our conditions weren't true, we want to just set the priority to low. That's going to be our fallback, right? Kind of how case assignment rules work as well, right? Goes through all the conditions, and if none of them are true, we just have a fallback condition, so something happens to it. So again, we're taking some value we know, amount, a number, and we're turning it into some text, right, in the form of a priority. All right, so I know workflow rules are going away in the next year or so, but you probably have some familiarity with how they work. And all of the Salesforce automation kind of works in the same way, right? And all relies on this concept of choosing some object that's going to fire the automation, right? In the case of this example, opportunity. We give a name to our automation, like update the priority. And we tell our automation when should it run. And we want our automation to run whenever a record is created, or whenever a record is created or edited, or whenever a record's created and then edited to meet criteria, right? But this notion of our automation here, we choose an object, we give the automation a name, and we say, hey, when do we want this automation to fire? And then from there, we can put conditions on our automation. We can manipulate the logic in those conditions, and we can do updates to Salesforce data. So we can update maybe an urgent attention needed field on an opportunity. Process pretty much the same way, right? Again, we choose an object, we choose when it's going to fire, we give the process a name, we can specify criteria of when it should fire, and then we can do some more things that we couldn't do with workflow. We can still update records, but now we can also create records, fire off other processes, fire off some code, submit for approval, things like that. And then we can take our processes and make really complex structures with them. We can move things around. We can specify, all right, I want this to run first, and then I want the next one to run, or I just want to stop altogether, right? And we can create really complex automation from here. Right, and then of course we have flow. And again, with flow, if you think about the record triggered flows, for example, it's the concept of we're going to choose an object, we're going to give the flow a name, we're going to choose when our flow should fire, right? Records are created, updated, deleted, etc. And then we can also specify, do we want our flows to fire before a record is saved or after a record is saved, right? Does this record need an ID for our automation to run, essentially? But something we're probably familiar with, or hopefully getting more familiar with, as flows kind of take over the future of automation for Salesforce administrators. But record trigger flows are very handy, but it follows kind of the same concept behind workflow rule and process builder. With flow, we get a little bit more functionality as well, though. We get this functionality of variables. So this variable functionality is the concept that we're going to take a value that we calculated, that we got, that we have in our flow. We're going to store it in a variable. And again, we have to specify what type of data it is, just like we did when we created our fields. It just specifies as a text variable, a number variable, whatever. We give our variable a name. And we can also have collection variables. So maybe I want to store more than one value at once. Maybe here I want a list of names instead of just a single name. So I can check this allow multiple values collection checkbox and say I want multiple text values to be stored in a single variable that I can then iterate over later. And of course, we iterate over these collection variables using a flow loop. And the loop's going to specify, again, what are we iterating over? And it's going to go through one by one item in our loop and do something with it. So maybe for each name in our list of names, we want to craft a customized email or something like that, right? But the idea of using a loop and a flow hopefully is not a foreign concept to us. Another thing we can do with flow variables is we can specify, hey, I want this available for input, or I want it available for output. Maybe I have a Lightning page that is sending a value to a flow. Maybe my flow is going to send a value to a Lightning web component, right? But the notion that we can change the visibility of variables, hopefully something we've seen as well. All right, and then with flows, we can also do some more things. Again, we can manipulate Salesforce record data. We can create records, we can update records, we can delete records now. Again, we can get records. So do a bunch of different things with Salesforce data, in addition to loops and things of that nature. And again, just like Process Builder, we can create very complex flows that are doing a bunch of things. We can order them, things like that. All right, so that's great. We talked about everything we already know how to do. What was the point of talking about all the stuff we already know, right? So now I'm going to try to prove to you, we're going to go through all the building blocks of Apex now that we went through all the building blocks of the configuration side of the platform. And I'm going to try to prove to you that Apex building blocks are just one step away from point and click. And we'll see if you agree with me. And we're going to start off just by summarizing what we already talked about, right? This is all the stuff we already talked about on the point and click side of the platform. The key concepts we went over, stuff you already know how to do. And now I'm going to go over the same concepts in Apex. So we talked about the concept of using conditional logic, right? We saw the if function and formulas. We saw we could set up conditions in workflow and process builder and flow with decision elements. And in Apex, we also have conditional logic, and we just call them if statements. We talked about the notion of creating variables, and we talked about how there are different instances in Salesforce where we need to tell Salesforce what type of data it is that we're storing with both flow variables and with fields that we create. And in Apex, we do the same thing, and we call them variables, just like in Flow. We talked about the idea that we can chain logic together. We saw a formula where we were passing our data up the chain of the functions. We saw we can create these complex process builders, we can create these complex flows, and we can create complex logic in Apex as well, and we call them methods and classes. We talked about the idea of being able to query for records. We saw an example with a report, right? We want some records based on some criteria. And we also saw the option to get records in our flow as well. And in Apex, we also have the option of querying for records, and we do this using something called SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language, very similar to SQL, if any of you have used SQL before. We also talked about this notion of choosing some object and an action to fire on, right? We do it with all the Salesforce automation, whether when we create workflows, when we create process builder, we create flow, it's all the same process. We choose some object to fire on, we give the automation some name, and then we specify when should this automation actually fire. Records are created, edited, deleted, etc. And in Apex, we do the exact same thing, and these are going to be our Apex triggers. We talked about the idea that we can loop over collection variables. We saw an example in Flow. We can also do it in Process Builder, and we can also do it in Apex. And in Apex, these are going to be our for loops. For each record in our list, we want to do something with it. And the last thing we talked about was this notion of manipulating S-object records. So now I want to, update a record, change a field, create a record, maybe even delete a record. We saw we can do it in all the Salesforce automation, workflow, process builder, and flow. And of course, we can do it in Apex as well. And we use what's called DML, or database manipulation language. So if there's one takeaway from the talk, I want it to be this, right? All of the key concepts that we use on the point and click side of the platform are the exact same key concepts that we use when writing Apex code. And now I'm going to walk through some examples and hopefully prove that to you. All right, so let's start off with the slide we saw before. Again, something you probably worked with before, conditional logic, right? If functions and formulas. And I have this formula on the left here, and I'm going to put up the exact same formula in Apex. So I might have some Apex code that looks something like this. And again, Don't worry about if you don't understand what every piece of syntax, every punctuation mark is doing, but try to understand what the code is doing on the whole. But we're going to walk through this code on the right here. And there are some boxes here that I want to highlight. So let's start with line 1. We have our if statement, just like we have our if function. And we have the word opportunity. So when we have a formula field, we know what record we're working with. It's the record that the field is on, right? So if I'm setting the priority on an opportunity, I'm going to check the amount on the same opportunity. But Apex, we have to tell it, hey, I want you to look at this record. So when we say in line 1, opportunity.amount, that just means we have some opportunity that we're calling opportunity. And we're saying, let me look at the amount on that opportunity. And if the amount on this opportunity is greater than 1 million, just like in our formula on the left, line 2 says set the priority on that opportunity to high. And again, we see our API name here with the __C. In line 4, we see another box here, and it's around the word else. And just like in our formula on the left, we have these different conditional statements. We can have multiple conditional statements in Apex as well. We just use the word else to indicate, hey, if the first one wasn't true, I want you to then follow up and check this one. So if our opportunity amount is greater than 1 million, set the priority to high. Else, if the amount is greater than 100,000, set the priority to medium. So else is just a keyword in Apex to indicate we want to check the next condition. And then in line 7, we have our final else. This is our fallback, just like in our formula. If none of the if statements were true, set the priority to low, right? Just like we have in our formula field there. So the code here doing the exact same thing. All right, let's go take a look at our variables again. We talked about them briefly in Flow, how we can create them. And when we create them, we have to give it a name, and we have to specify what type they're going to be, just like we do when we're creating fields on an object. And in Apex, we're going to do pretty much the exact same thing. And some variable declarations might look something like this. And again, some things I want to highlight here. So let's start with line 1. We see the word integer. So if you remember back to school level math, an integer is just a number. So line 1 says I have some number, some integer. I have to give it a name, just like we do in our Flow variables and our fields. So I have an integer called myInt, and I'm going to set it equal to the value of 10. Okay, let's take a look at line 2. I see another word in a box, string. String is just code for text. It's a string of characters. So I have some text value, a string. Again, I give it a name, my string. And I'm going to set my string equal to a text value, Harry Potter is awesome. Everything in the quotes is going to be assigned to that one string variable. So my string equals Harry Potter is awesome. Okay, great. Let's look at line 3. In addition to creating things like integers and string variables, we can create Salesforce object variables. So here in line 3, we have an account variable. And again, we give it a name. We're going to call it my account. And we're going to set it equal to some new empty shell of an account, right? We can populate some fields later if we want, but for now, just a new account. And then lines 4 and 5, just like we saw in our flow, we can create collection variables. So I want more than one value stored in my variable. We can do that in Apex also. The most common collection is a list. And so line 4, we see the word list. It's going to be a list of integers. So a list of numbers. Again, we give it a name, myInt list. And line 4 says, I want a new list of integers called myInt list, and I want it set it equal to the values 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I want all 5 values in my myInt list. And then line 5, again, we have a list. Now we're going to have a list of strings or text values. We're going to call it houses. And we're going to say this is going to be equal to the values Gryffindor and Ravenclaw. So both of these string values are going to be stored in my list of strings called houses. All right, and again, the concept of a variable, we're setting it now, and we can reference it later on in our code, just like we do in our flow. All right, let's go talk about formulas again. So if you remember when we talked about formula fields, formulas are this notion of we're going to take some input that we know, we're going to do some black box calculation on it, and we're going to end up with an output whose data type we have to specify ahead of time. And again, we do the same thing in Apex, and we call them methods. And again, a method is going to take some input parameters, they're called in code, some input parameters that we know. It's going to do some method calculation on it, and it's going to return some output value whose data type we have to specify beforehand. So let's take a look at some example methods here. And we'll start off with our very basic formula we talked about, where the deadline equals today plus 5. We took a value we knew, today's date, we added 5 to it, and we ended up with a date 5 days from now. So let's take a look at something similar now in Apex. So I have a block of code here, and I'm going to skip ahead to line 5. And line 5 says I'm going to create a new integer variable called myInt, and I want to set it equal to the number 12. Okay. So I have an integer, myInt, equal to the value of 12. Now line 6 says I'm going to create another integer variable, and I'm going to call it myNewInt. And instead of setting it to the value of a number directly, I'm going to set it to the output of some calculation. So line 6 says I'm going to set myNewInt equal to add5 myInt. What is add5 myInt? Well, add5 refers to this add5 method we have defined in line 1. In line 6, we see in the parentheses myInt. We're going to give add5 as an input parameter myInt. All right, so let's go take a look at add5. If we go up to line 1 where add5 was defined, we see we have a box around the word integer, which tells us our output, just like our formula. So at the end of add5, I need to end up with some integer. And that integer will then be assigned to myNewInt in line 6. And what's my starting point for add5? Well, I see integer x at the end of line 1. So that tells me that add5 is going to take some integer called x and then do something with it. If I now look at line 2, we know that we're taking an x. In our case, x is 12 because we passed in myInt, which is 12. So we're taking x, which is 12. We're adding 5 to it, just like in our formula on the left. And then we see this other word, return. Return just means I have the value I want. This is my output, and end the method. So I'm taking my x, which is 12. I'm adding 5 to it, and I'm going to return 12 plus 5, which is 17. And line 6 is taking that 17 and assigning it to myNewInt. So I have some code after this. After line 6, I'm going to be pretty confident that myNewInt is going to be the value of 17, because that's what the method calculated. All right, let's go take a look at a little more complex method here. And let's go back to our date time submitted of our job application. Remember, we started with December 3rd, 2021, 10:15 a.m. And we turned our date time into the text value 10. And now we're going to do the same thing in Apex. And I'm going to get a block of code that looks like this. And again, we're going to start a little bit lower in line 10. And we're going to say, all right, line 10, I have a new string called myHour. And I want myHour equal to the value that gets calculated from getApplicationSubmitHour with an input of application.dateTimeSubmitted. Okay, so again, we're going to assume that datetime submitted is December 3rd, 2021, 10:15 a.m. And getApplicationSubmitHour that we're calling in line 10 gets defined again in line 1. And if we take a look at line 1, we see in our box the word string, which tells us whenever we're exiting this method, we need to end up with a string, a text value, just like our formula up above. And at the end of line 1, we see datetime dt. So again, this is going to be our input parameter. So our getApplicationSubmitHour method is going to take some date time value we're going to call dt, and we need to end up with a string or a text value at the end. And just like our formula, we're going to start with our date time. And line 3 says, all right, I want a new variable called integer, or a new variable of type integer called hour. And just like we have an hour function in our formula, we have an hour method we can call in Apex. And that says, give me the hour of a date time. So just like in our formula, we're going to take our December 3rd, 2021, 10:15 a.m. and turn it into the hour 10, the number 10. And we're going to assign it to the hour variable in line 3. All right, great. So now we have the number 10 in our hour variable. Let's jump down to line 5. And just like we have the text function in our formula, we have the string.value of method in Apex. And this is going to take something and turn it into a string interpretation of it. So just like our formula, we're going to take the number 10 and we're going to turn it into the text 10. And we're going to assign that text 10 to a string variable called hour in text in line 5. Okay, great. We started with our date time. We got our string that we needed. Now line 7, we can return that string 10 and exit our method and assign it back to its original source, my hour from line 10. So if I have some code that runs after this block, the my hour variable we created in line 10 is going to be the value 10 based on the input we passed into the method. All right, let's go take a look at this slide again. So again, if you remember back to reports, it's this concept of we're going to choose some object, we're going to get some fields from the object, and we're going to specify some condition for the records that we want. Right, and again, we're going to do this in Apex using something called SOQL, Salesforce Object Query Language. And it's going to look something like this. We're going to start with the word select. We're going to specify the fields that we want. We're going to have the word from. We're going to specify the object that we want. We're going to have the word where, and we're going to have our condition. So just like our report, we're getting some fields from some object where some condition is true. And if we run this in any new dev org, we're going to get the same 11 records that we would have gotten from our report, right? We're going to get all of the name, type, and rating fields from the account object, where the type is customer direct or customer channel, just like in our report. And so every SOQL query you'll see in Apex will have the same format. Select some fields from some object where some condition is true. All right, we talked about this as well, the concept of Salesforce automation, and how when we create some automation, we have to specify the object it's going to run on. We have to specify when the automation is going to fire for what event or events, and we have to give the automation a name. And again, we do the same thing in Apex, and these are called Apex triggers. And every Apex trigger in your org is going to look something like this. It's going to start on line 1 with the word trigger, just telling it that it's a trigger. It's going to have the name of the trigger. Just like we name our automation, we have to name our triggers. So we're going to call this one account trigger. It's going to be on some object, just like our automation. So here we're going to be on account. And it's going to specify what events it should fire on. So in our case, we want to fire our trigger when records are inserted, updated, or deleted. And just like in our flow, we can specify, do we want it to run before or after save? So in our case, this trigger would run before records are inserted, before records are updated, or before records are deleted. And so if you go into the setup menu in your org and search for Apex triggers, all of your triggers are going to have the same pattern to start with. It's going to be the word trigger, the name of the trigger, what object it's on, and when it's firing. And so if you're trying to figure out, okay, what happens when an account gets created in my org, you can go into the Apex triggers. You can look at all the triggers on account. Hopefully there's only one, but it's possible there may be more than one. Look at the active triggers, of course, as well. And then you can see, okay, which triggers have a before or after insert event on them. And those are the triggers that are going to run whenever accounts are created. Right, but it's the same as all the other automation you already built, right? It's on some object, it has a name, and we specified when it's going to run in relation to that object. Right, we talked about this as well, the idea that we can run loops in flows. And in Apex, we're going to run loops as well. And we're going to use something called a for loop. For each record in our list, let's do something with it. And so we have 2 code blocks here. Let's walk through them one at a time. The first one is going to start with some list of opportunities. And we're going to call this list of opportunities oplist. And we're going to call some method somewhere that just runs a query that gets us a bunch of opportunities. All right, so we have a bunch of opportunities in our op list. And we're going to say for each opportunity O in our op list, set the amount on each O to 10,000, right? And so O can be whatever we want. It's a temporary name for the purposes of our loop. But this is going to set the amount on each O through our op list to 10,000. And the loop is smart enough to know once it's gone through all the opportunities in the list, it'll just exit and continue running the rest of the code. So let's look at an example where we actually do something with this loop data. Let's calculate a value. So we'll start in line 1 with a new list of integers, the same one we saw at the beginning, called myIntList. And we're going to set myIntList to a new list of integers with the values 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 in it. And line 2, we're going to say I want a new variable type integer called total. And let's start off total equals 0. And I'm going to run my for loop. For each integer, I'm going to call I. In my int list, I want to update the total to be the previous total plus I. So what's that going to look like? Well, our for loop is going to start running on our my int list variable. And when it starts running on my int list, it's going to look at the first value, 1, and that's going to be our I. So I is equal to 1. And line 4 says, all right, total, which is 0, is going to equal the previous total, 0, plus I, which is 1. Okay, great. Now total is 1. For loop will run again. I moves to the next value. I is now 2. The total is going to equal our previous total, 1, plus 2. So now our total is 3. All right, our for loop runs again. I is now 3. Total is going to be 3 plus 3, which is 6. Okay, loop keeps going. I is now 4. Total is going to be 6 plus 4, which is 10. Loop runs one last time. I is now 5. Our total is going to be 10 plus 5, which is 15. No value is left in the loop. Loop exits, and the code continues running. But we know that after the code finishes running, our total variable is now going to be the value of 15, because that's what we calculated from our loop. So we loop through the items one by one for each item in our list. And maybe we're updating some records, like in the top example. Maybe we're calculating a value, like in the bottom example. And once the list has been exhausted, the code exits and can keep running after that. All right, and the last concept we talked about was this notion that we can change Salesforce data, manipulating S-object records, and we're going to do it with something called database manipulation language, or DML. Right? We saw it already in workflows, we saw it in Process Builder, and we saw it in Flow as well. And DML, while it says it's its own language, it's actually a pretty simple language to learn. It's only 4 or 5 words long, and the words are going to look something like this. Right? All these words in the boxes here. That's the whole language. And so if we take a look at this, you can think of database manipulation language as basically hitting a button in the Salesforce UI. Right? So for example, if I go into the UI and say I want a new account and I populate a bunch of fields, until I click save on the account, Salesforce is just going to ignore it. And it's the same thing here. In line 1, I'm creating an account called new account, and I'm setting an equal to some new account. I'm setting in the name is Hogwarts. Until I run that DML statement in line 2, that insert statement, Salesforce is going to ignore it. Now line 2, once I hit that save button, I run the DML, I'm going to insert the new account that I just created in line 1. All right, let's go take a look. And then, of course, once we insert it, the validations will fire, the triggers will run, and the additional automation can fire as well. But none of that will happen until my DML statement runs. Take a look at another example in line 4. Maybe I'll have an opportunity called op and have another SQL query. Remember, like our report. I'm going to select the amount field from the opportunity object where the parent account name is Westeros. And I want to set the amount on this op variable to $1 million. And once I do that, I'm going to run my DML statement in line 7. Again, it's the equivalent of a save button, and I'm going to update my opportunity. Another DML statement. All right, once I update my opportunity, somebody tells me, hey, this opportunity was never supposed to exist to begin with. I can run another DML statement in line 9 to delete it. And this is going to delete the opportunity from the org, just like if I hit the delete button in the Salesforce UI. Right, but this notion of updating records is something we've seen before in automation, and again, something we can do in Apex using DML statements. All right, so we talked about a lot of different concepts in Apex. So let's go take a look at a concrete example and put it all together. Before we do that, I just want to talk about, okay, where are we going to find all this Apex in our org? And for the most part, you're going to see it in one of 2 places. You're going to see it either in Apex triggers, which, as we saw, is going to fire based on some event, right? So some record is being created, updated, or deleted, or undeleted in some cases, and that's what's going to cause the triggers to fire. So if you go into your setup menu, search for Apex triggers, you'll find them all there. The other primary place we're going to see Apex is going to be in our Apex classes. And the Apex classes are going to run in one of a couple ways. They can be called by a trigger, they can be called by another class, or they can be scheduled to run. So maybe I want to run some code every night at midnight. Instead of having to wait up to midnight every night and click run, I can just schedule it to run at midnight and it'll run on its own, right? And again, we can go into the setup menu, search for Apex classes, and you're going to find all the Apex classes from there as well. But really, these are all just files. Like you'd have a Word doc or a PDF on the computer. All these Apex triggers and classes, they're just files. All right, so let's go take a look at an example trigger here. And we're going to go through it line by line, how I recommend you go through any code. If you start going through the code in your org, it might look a little bit overwhelming, but just go through it line by line, make it a lot easier to comprehend. So we're going to start off with the trigger here. This trigger is called account trigger, and it's going to run on the account object. And it's going to run before accounts are inserted and before accounts are updated. Right? So just like the trigger example we saw earlier, we have the word trigger. We have the word trigger. We have the name of the trigger. We have the object it's running on, and we have when it's running. Okay, let's go through the next block of our code here. We'll start with line 3, and we see something new here. First, we're just creating a list of accounts called new accounts. And we're setting that equal to something called trigger.new. Trigger.new is just a special thing in a trigger to basically ask the trigger some information about itself. In this case, we're asking the trigger, what are the new records that caused you to fire? What records were inserted? What records were updated? Right? And all of these records are going to be stored in a variable called trigger.new. For simplicity's sake, we're going to assign those values to a variable called new accounts. So maybe I'm uploading 100 records at once using data loader. Those 100 records are going to be in trigger.new. And you can contrast that with trigger.old. Maybe I'm changing 100 records, right? It'll let me easily compare the new value of those records with trigger.new with the old value of those records in trigger.old. But for now, we're just using the new records that were newly inserted or newly updated in trigger.new, and I'm storing it in a separate variable called new accounts in line 3. Right, and then I can keep asking the trigger about itself. I can say, hey, trigger, are you an insert trigger? So again, we have an if statement like we had in our formula field, or our formula fields. We can say, hey, trigger, are you running because some records were inserted? And if so, we can go into line 6. If not, we'll just jump to the end of our if block after line 9. But if it is an insert trigger, we're going to run our for loop in line 6. And let's say this scenario, we have a bunch of legacy data in our org. And for all of the new data being inserted into Salesforce directly, we want to update the name of the record to be the name plus Salesforce. So we can have a for loop in line 6 that says for each account A in our new accounts that we specified in line 3, change the name on this A to be the name plus Salesforce. So all the newly inserted accounts in Salesforce will have the word Salesforce at the end of the account name. Okay, great. What if the trigger is not running because records are inserted, but it's running because records were updated? So line 11, if it was not an insert trigger, it could be an update trigger. So it's running because records were updated. So we have in line 11, our else if, check our next condition. Is this running because trigger was running because of updated records? If so, we're going to go to line 12. And we're going to run some code that says account helper.process accounts. And this is going to be similar to what we saw in our methods before. We're going to have a method somewhere called process accounts, and we're going to pass it as an input our new accounts. So we're going to give our process accounts method our list of accounts. Now, process accounts is not located in our trigger. It's actually located in a separate file in a class called account helper. So the account helper class, the process accounts method, and we're giving it all the new accounts, in this case, accounts that have been updated. So let's go take a look at that code. So let's go take a look at the account helper class that we're calling. So this class is running because it was called from a trigger. And so again, like before, our class is very similar to the trigger, except instead of having the word trigger, it has the word class. And just like our trigger, we have the name. So we have the word class. We have our class name, account helper. And then line 2, we have our process accounts method. We know we passed in new accounts. So great, we already know what that is, the accounts that were newly updated. So we see our process accounts method takes a list of accounts. And we also see in line 2 that our process accounts method is going to return a list of opportunities at the end. So we have to go somewhere from account to opportunity. All right, let's take a look at the next block of code. We have another variable, a list of opportunities called ops list. And ops list is going to be set equal to the value from a SOQL query. And the SOQL query is going to say, I want to get the notes field from the opportunity object where the parent account is in those new accounts that were updated. So basically, give me all the opportunities for all the newly updated accounts. Once I have these opportunities, I can run a for loop and say for each opportunity O in my ops list, set the notes field on O to be that the parent account was updated. So every time we update accounts, we want to make sure all the opportunity notes fields get set to the parent account was updated. Once we've updated all of our opportunities, right, the for loop's gone through everything in ops list, we can run our DML statement in line 10, updating our ops list. Again, that's a massive save button to save all our records at once. And now we have our list of opportunities. That's what our method needed. We can run line 12, which will return a list of opportunities back to our trigger, or maybe we could do something else with it. All right. So hopefully that example puts some things into perspective. Let's talk about where to go from here in next steps. So again, at the end of the day, code is just ones and zeros, and Salesforce makes it very easy to write code using these point and click tools that humans can understand. But at the end of the day, declarative tools in Salesforce are based on various key concepts, and Apex concepts are based on these exact same concepts as the declarative side of the platform. And you can combine all these Apex building blocks together into triggers and classes. Once again, I believe if you can understand code and you can run a Google search, you can begin the process of writing code. And if you can understand the admin tools on the declarative side of the platform and add a little bit of syntax, you can understand code. And hopefully you've already begun that process. And if you still don't feel like a developer yet, I promise you that you're almost there. All right, where to go from here? A lot of great places to start. I always recommend Trailhead as a first starting point. A lot of good modules on there: Apex Basics and Database, Apex Triggers, Apex Basics for admins, and a quick start project. My coworker at Google, David Liu, has a great website, sfdc99.com, with a lot of Apex examples as well. And one of the Trailhead evangelism experts on the Trailhead team, Kieran Jameson, has a great website, womencodeheroes.com, that I suggest checking out as well for a bunch more great examples. Conferences like this, conferences like Dreamforce, also great ways to get some hands-on experience, maybe hands-on training, maybe attend a developer talk, and I think you'll understand more than you think you will. With that, thank you so much. Again, I'm Adam Olshansky. Feel free to connect with me on Twitter, shoot me an email, and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.